Let's break down every single must-start defense going into Week 12 of the fantasy season and go over every defense that you can add off of the waiver wire to help you guys dominate Week 12 of the 2024 fantasy football season. And before we do so, let me remind you that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 12 NFL pick'ems are already going live, and all of their pick'ems for Monday Night Football have also already gone live. And Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL pick'em to use towards Week 12 or towards Monday Night Football. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So it's a free NFL pick'em to use towards this week's action, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. So let's very quickly start by going over this week's schedule. Let's start with the fact that we have the Falcons, Bills, Bengals, Jets, Saints, and Jaguars all on bye week here in Week 12. The Bills have obviously had some good defensive performances over the past couple of weeks. We're not going to be able to start them. The Jets, one of these teams I think is rostered too highly in leagues. You can go ahead and drop them. No reason at this point to consider them a threatening defense from a fantasy perspective. The Saints have had some streaming capacity over the past couple of weeks. Not going to be able to start them. And then obviously we're trying to stream teams against the Jaguars. We will not be able to do so here in Week 12. All right, and let's very quickly take a further look at this week's schedule, starting with a short week for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I do think that they're a good start this week, but they sit at 75% rostered, so unlikely you're going to be able to pick them up. And I also don't really like short weeks, but they're coming off of a 10 fantasy point performance against the Baltimore Ravens, where they did have 2 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, and an interception, and held one of the best offenses in the league to just 16 fantasy points. We know that there's turnover potential with Jameis Winston as a starting quarterback, although he has not thrown an interception, or he did not throw an interception, in that Week 11 performance against the Saints, but he did throw 3 in Week 9 and then should have had like 2 against the Ravens in Week 8. So we'll see. I mean, he threw nearly 400 passing yards this past week, but I still think the Steelers are a good enough option this week, even on a short week. Let me look a little bit further. There's an opportunity for the Dolphins to have a nice day against Drake May and company. Drake May has looked very good, but he still has had an issue in terms of turnovers the past couple of weeks, with 4 interceptions in his last 3 starts and 2 lost fumbles in those last 3 starts as well. So there is some opportunity for the Miami Dolphins this week, but they kind of disappointed with just 5 fantasy points in Week 11 against the Raiders after having 10 fantasy points in Week 10 against the LA Rams. Then we've got the Kansas City Chiefs, which I think a lot of people are going to just go out and start because they play the Carolina Panthers, but I want to be a little bit careful with this one. I've said all season long, the Chiefs, great defense. Not a great fantasy defense. They just gave up 30 total points to the Buffalo Bills and had just 1 fantasy point against the Bills this past week. But the Bills, obviously a very different team than the Carolina Panthers. We all know that. But Bryce Young has been okay. Past couple weeks hasn't been as bad as usual, but he does have 3 interceptions in his last 3 games. So I do think that they're a good start, but I don't quite know if they have like this crazy high ceiling that everybody is anticipating this week. But nonetheless, they are a good start this week. Then I think the Lions are interesting. I think some people are going to run to start the Lions this week, going up against the Colts, coming off of a 10 fantasy point day against the Jacksonville Jaguars, 8 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 8. I think some people are going to risk it against Anthony Richardson and company. Richardson looked much, much better this past week throwing the ball, but he did have 2 fumbles, one of them lost. So we know that there is turnover potential with Anthony Richardson. I think they're an interesting start, but just not one of my favorites. And we have the Niners at the Packers, 2 defenses that we've been able to use throughout the season that in this matchup, I just don't think are going to be viable options. And the Packers kind of disappointed this past week with just 5 fantasy points. And the Niners against Geno Smith, who in his last performance had 3 interceptions, had just 6 fantasy points. So I don't feel very good about that. Then we got the Eagles and the Rams, 2 teams that we've talked about quite a bit as of late. But in this matchup, I just don't love it. And the Eagles end up with just 6 fantasy points this past week. Then the Rams ended up with a nice 11 fantasy points against Drake May and the New England Patriots. But I don't think they're going to do that against the Philadelphia Eagles this week. And then to finish week 12 here, we've got the Ravens at the Chargers. So I know the Chargers have been great, but I don't feel confident enough to start them against the Baltimore Ravens. And that Ravens defense has been more than a disappointment so far on this season. So it's a very interesting week for streaming options for the defensive special teams slot. But let's break down my 6 top options going into week 12. All right, and you already know who we're starting with. Let's talk about the Minnesota Vikings very quickly here. As they do sit at 92% roster, they're holding that number 1 overall spot in terms of fantasy defenses strong, with 11 fantasy points in week 11 against the Titans. Another solid performance, allowing just 13 fantasy points, 5 sacks, 1 interception. They have been fantastic on the season. 30 sacks, 6 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries, 15 picks, 3 scoring touchdowns. Facing Caleb Williams and company this week, I don't see any reason why this streak slows down by any stretch. Now, Caleb was a little bit better with no Shane Waldron as an offensive coordinator, 23 of 31, 231 passing yards, no turnovers, and it's worth noting. He's only had 2 turnovers since week 5. He did have 70 yards on the ground, which was interesting, and the offense did look better with the change at offensive coordinator, but certainly didn't look very inspiring. This is a home game for the Bears. But at the end of the day, come on, we're starting the Vikings. You own the Vikings. You keep rolling with them. They're the best defense in fantasy football. They're one of the best defenses in the league. You own the Vikings. You're going to keep rolling with them. Unfortunately, you can't pick them up off the waiver wire, but they are undoubtedly a must-start defense here in Week 12. Next up, let's talk about the Washington Commanders, who will be facing the Dallas Cowboys at home. And we are all expecting the Dallas Cowboys to be one of the best teams to stream against on a week-in, week-out basis at this point in the season. Now, Monday Night Football has not been played at the time of recording this. Maybe the Cowboys surprise us against the Texans and this call doesn't look as strong. We could reevaluate if that happens, but we'll just go ahead and guess that the Commanders are going to be a strong streaming option against Cooper Rush or Trey Lance and whoever we get for the Dallas Cowboys at quarterback and whoever is alive on this offense after Monday Night Football. Commanders, I think, are going to be a very strong option going into the week. Then they get the Tennessee Titans, Will Levis and company in Week 13. So I think they're going to be a strong option over the next 2 weeks. And definitely a good team to go ahead and pick up off the waiver wire, as I said, at just 29% rostered. So looks like they're going to have some nice streaming capacity over the next 2 weeks. Once again, something unexpected happens with the Cowboys on Monday Night Football. We can talk about it in the comments section down below. But ultimately, I want to pick up the Commanders, start them against the Dallas Cowboys, Cooper Rush, whoever it's going to be a quarterback in Week 12. And the nice thing is this video is releasing before Monday Night Football. So if you have a player that you're able to drop before Week 12's waiver period has started, you may be able to add the Commanders now and get ahead of your league mates. Next up, let's talk about a team that hasn't made the videos all year long, and that's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, sitting as the defense 22 in fantasy scoring. And I like them a lot, not just here in Week 12, but moving forward on the rest of the season. If you guys watched last week's league winning moves video, we talked about this strength of schedule for the rest of the season for this defense. Week 12, they will get the Giants, which we'll break down in a second here, but then they get the Panthers, then they get the Raiders. Tough matchup on the road against the Chargers in Week 15, but then they get the Cowboys, then they get the Panthers. So we're looking at Daniel Jones or Drew Lock in Week 12, then Bryce Young, Gardner Minshew, Cooper Rush, and then Bryce Young again if we're excluding the Chargers game in Week 15. So this is a very strong strength of schedule. They sit at just 25% rostered. This is a team that can help you win and dominate your league the rest of the season. I know they haven't been a very good defense on the year with just 10 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries, 5 picks, and 1 scoring touchdown, 28 sacks on the season. But they have had some moments. Week 4 against Philly, Week 6 against the Saints. they've had some moments, but they've had a lot of bad moments, and the secondary is not very good. But the upside is here. The risk, I think, is worth it for the rest of the season, looking at this strength of schedule. Even if you don't start them right away, you just want to kind of see what happens. They are a good team to stash for now because they're going to have a ton of upside and a ton of great matchups to wrap up the season. In week 12, we don't quite know at the time recording this. Are we going to see Daniel Jones at quarterback for the Giants? Are we going to see Drew Lock? We'll have to wait and find out. Either way, there's going to be turnover potential for the Buccaneers on the road in week 12 against the Giants. So they're a good start in week 12. We don't need to dig too deep into that, but for the rest of the season, this is a team that I really want to take a chance on as we start to wrap up the fantasy season. This is going to be one of the defenses with the most upside as we wrap up the season. Next up, let's talk about the Denver Broncos coming back into the spotlight after a tough couple of weeks. 13 fantasy points in week 11. They had an interception, 4 sacks, and only allowed 6 points to the Atlanta Falcons. This week on the road, they get Gardner Minshew and company. The last time they played the Raiders, they had 15 fantasy points. This is a top 5 unit in terms of defensive scoring in fantasy football. Little tough stretch there going up against the Panthers, the Ravens, the Chiefs. It was a little bit surprising to see them not play so well against the Panthers. They also had a tough game in week 6 against the Chargers. But outside of that, since week 3, double digits in every other performance. Was nice to see it come back to fruition in week 11 in a strong home victory. So not a ton to break down here. We're looking at the Raiders. They've been one of the best teams to stream against in terms of defensive teams on the season, even if the Dolphins kind of let us down this past week. But ultimately, this is a good matchup for the Denver Broncos. They have dropped to 50% rostered. So if they're out there and available, they're definitely a strong addition. They're kind of right on that line of they may or may not be available. It's kind of a coin flip depending on your league. I think they're a strong addition for sure. A great start this week. They do get Jameis Winston and company at home in week 13. Could be another opportunity for turnovers in week 13 and another strong start before they hit the bye week in week 14. So strong overall performance in week 11. Great matchup here in week 12. And luckily, this team has dropped down to 50% roster. If they're out there and available, they are a must-add, must-start defense in week 12. Okay, next up, I want to talk about the Arizona Cardinals sitting at just 5% rostered on bye week in week 11. This is the other defense we talked about in the league winning moves video. They had 13 fantasy points in each of their last 2 starts, 9 or more fantasy points in 3 of their last 4 starts. And their strength of schedule for the remainder of the season is very strong. At Seattle in week 12, Geno Smith. I mean, they got the victory against the Niners, don't get me wrong. But Geno Smith ended up throwing an interception and having a fumble. He did have a rushing touchdown, but that makes for 1, 2, 3 fumbles in Geno Smith's last 3 games and 1, 2, 5 interceptions in his last 3 games. So there's plenty of turnover potential with Geno Smith. And then the following week, they're going to face the Minnesota Vikings, and Darnold better in week 11, but he did have a lost fumble, 3 interceptions in week 10, 2 interceptions and a lost fumble in week 9. So more turnover potential in week 12, even if I don't think it's as strong. And then they're going to face Seattle at home again in week 14 before facing Drake May and the New England Patriots in week 15, first game of the fantasy playoffs, then Bryce Young in week 16. And while it's not a crazy strong start, a decent start in the fantasy championship in week 17 against Matthew Stafford and the LA Rams. Stafford looked much better this past week after having an interception in 6 straight games. But obviously, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, healthy, all that stuff. Now, nonetheless, they have a very strong strength of schedule for the remainder of the season. They get a good matchup against the Seahawks this week, and they're only sitting at 5% rostered. This is a team right now, the top of their division. They could really wrap up the season in strong fashion. This is a great strength of schedule. And overall, this is one of my favorite streaming options going into the week. And a team similar to the Bucs, if they're out there and available, they're worth just stashing to see what happens. The upside is going to be there as we wrap up the remainder of the fantasy season. Last team I want to talk about is the Houston Texans, who, once again, this video is going to come out before Monday Night Football has been played. It's going to be recorded before Monday Night Football. We'll see how they do against the Dallas Cowboys on the road, but I'm going to expect that it's pretty good. They've jumped up to 78% rostered. So we'll see what happens. A lot of people starting them in week 11. Nonetheless, they have had 8 or more fantasy points in every game since week 6, except for week 9 on the road against the Jets. I do think that the Texans have some issues in their secondary, don't get me wrong, but they're putting up some pretty decent points in terms of fantasy points. So we'll see how they look against the Cowboys in week 11 against Cooper Rush and company. I'm expecting that it's going to be pretty good. They're going to have another nice streaming opportunity in week 12 against Will Levis and company. Levis, since he's taken back that starting spot in terms of the quarterback position for the Titans, an interception in week 11, a fumble in week 10. By Will Levis standards, those are much improved, but we know that there's plenty of turnover upside when it comes to Will Levis as a starting quarterback, as we saw through the first 6 weeks of the season, where he had an interception or fumble in every game and had an interception and fumble in 3 of those games. So we know that there's turnover potential here when we're facing Will Levis. The Texans, kind of a hot team right now in terms of defense and fantasy scoring. Once again, we'll see what happens against the Cowboys, but I'm expecting it to be good. If it's not, we'll talk about it in the comments down below. This is a team that sits at 78% rostered, like I said, so maybe not as available on the waiver wire, but if they're out there and available, they should make for a good streaming defense here in week 12. And that'll do it for today's video. There are your must-start defenses and streams as we move into week 12 of the fantasy season. As always, guys, if you need anything whatsoever moving into week 12, drop me a comment down below. I'll get back to each and every comment on this video. And on top of that, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel, because as the week progresses, we're going to have everything you could possibly need here on the channel to help you guys dominate week 12 of 2024 fantasy football. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.